Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rukhsana Rahman, Department of Women's Studies, Guwahati University. I will be speaking on violence. This lecture will focus on different types of violence which has been against women in a displaced situation. This lecture will also focus on different UN resolutions to deal with such problems. This is, I quote, "The intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment or deprivation." This has been cited in World Report on Violence and Health, Geneva, World Health Organization in the year 2002, page number 4. While discussing the issue of violence against women, it has been found that during the 1960s and 1970s, the issue of violence against women gained prominence in the international level. With this new focus, different types of violence against women began to draw attention of academicians, bureaucrats and international organizations. Various types of violence against women have been categorized as emotional, sexual, physical and psychological. The recommendation 19 adopted in the 11th session of the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women (CEDAW) in 1992 describes gender violence as, I quote, "Violence which is directed against a woman because she is a woman or which affects women disproportionately. It includes acts which inflicts physical, mental or sexual harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion and other deprivation of liberty." International agencies like UN Women have been working actively to end violence against women. In almost all such initiatives, the breakdown of all systems during conflict is not factored in. That is why the question of conflict-related violence against women has to have a different set of rules and regulations in place. It is only since 1985 that the issue of conflict-related violence against women is being addressed as a separate issue that needs different initiatives and laws. While looking at the timeline, in the year 1985, the first working group on refugee women is convened to advocate for the needs of women affected by conflict. The working group's lobbying activities result in the 1989 appointment of a senior coordinator for refugee women to UNHCR. In 1990, UNHCR adopts the first ever policy on refugee women's protection, from which evolved UNHCR's 1991 guidelines on the protection of refugee women. By highlighting the general protection needs of women affected by conflict as distinct from men, the guidelines set the stage for standardizing programming that specifically target women. The guidelines explicitly acknowledge exposure to sexual violence as a vulnerability of refugee women and calls upon the humanitarian community to address it within its protection mandate. In the year 1994, the Women's Commission for Refugee Women and Children releases the study Refugee Women and Reproductive Health, Reassessing Priorities. This study reveals that even the most basic reproductive health services, including those to address violence against women, were not available to women displaced by war. Again in 1994, the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo identifies GBV response as one of 4 basic pillars of reproductive health programming. At the same conference, minimum health standards for refugees are expanded to include reproductive health services and, by extension, treatment for victims of sexual violence. The need for these services is reinforced by media coverage in Bosnia and Rwanda, illustrating for the world the extent to which women and girls are targets of sexual violence during war and challenging donor attention to the issue. Reproductive health in general and sexual violence in particular becomes part of the agenda of donors and humanitarian agencies charged with responding to the needs of the conflict affected. The intersection of the fields of reproductive health and VAWG also allowed for a greater understanding of the physical and mental health impacts of violence against women, including STIs, reproductive tract trauma, unwanted pregnancy, and complications associated with unsafe abortions, somatic complaints, depression, and suicide. In 1995, UNHCR publishes Sexual Violence Against Refugees, Guidelines on Protection and Response, which highlights some of the major legal, medical, and psychosocial components of prevention and response to sexual violence. Also in 1995, UNHCR and the United Nations Population Fund UNFPA form an interagency working group IAWG of expert international reproductive health organizations. In 1996, the IAWG produces an interagency field manual, Reproductive Health in Refugee Situations, which includes information about the prevention and management of gender-based violence from emergency to stable phases of displacement, but does not articulate detailed methodologies for developing specialized field-based programs or protocols to tackle VAWG. In 1996, UNHCR receives a large financial award from an United Nations Foundation to address gender-based violence in 5 countries in East and West Africa over a 4-year period, becoming the first organized effort to establish a multi-sectoral approach to various forms of violence against women and girls. The programs include healthcare services, psychosocial support, security through training, and support for local police and legal assistance through local lawyers and training and support for court staff. The initiative produced several how-to guides. First is UNHCR How to Guide Reproductive Health in Refugee Situations, a community-based response on sexual violence against women, Nagara, Tanzania, UNHCR, January 1997. UNHCR How to Guide Reproductive Health in Refugee Situations, Building a Team Approach to the Prevention and Response to Sexual Violence, Report of a Technical Mission, Kigoma, Tanzania, UNHCR 1998. UNHCR How to Guide Reproductive Health in Refugee Situations from Awareness to Action, Pilot Project to Eradicate Female Genital Mutilation, Hati Sheikh, Ethiopia, UNHCR, December 1997. UNHCR How to Guide Reproductive Health in Refugee Situations, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Program in Guinea, UNHCR, January 2001. UNHCR How to Guide Reproductive Health in Refugee Situations, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Program in Liberia, UNHCR, January 2001. At the end of the 4-year initiative, UNHCR publishes Prevention and Response to Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Refugee Situations, Interagency Lessons, Learned Conference Proceedings, Geneva, UNHCR 2001, a good lesson review in which the multi-sectoral approach is determined to be fundamental to combating VAWG. In 2000, UNHCR 1325 on Women, Peace and Security is adopted. It is the first SCR to link women to the peace and security agenda. It recognizes that women are disproportionately affected by conflict and calls for their active participation at all levels of decision making in conflict resolutions, conflict prevention, peace processes, post-conflict peace building and governance. It has been followed by additional SCRs on Women, Peace and Security 1820, 2008, 1888 in 2009, 1889 in 2009, 1960 in 2010 and 2106 in 2013. In the year 2001, the Reproductive Health Response in Conflict RHRC Consortium initiates a global assessment of the major types of gender-based violence occurring in conflict-affected settings, related programming and gaps in programming. Its findings and recommendations are detailed in If Not Now, When, addressing gender-based violence in refugee, internally displaced and post-conflict settings. In 2002, the international media breaks the story of sexual exploitation and abuse (SEA) committed by humanitarian staff against refugee women and girls in West Africa. The public outrage and embarrassment leads to an increase in attention and funds for gender-based violence interventions. At the same time, both UN agencies and NGOs begin to take action to address SEA among humanitarian staff. Codes of conduct for staff are developed and the SG issues his bulletin on special measures against SEA. In 2002, Emerging Issues in Gender-Based Violence Programming is published by the RHRC, addressing some of the critical issues and challenges to implementing gender-based violence programming in conflict-affected settings. In 2002, UNIFEM publishes a special report on progress of the world's women focused on women, war and peace, and comprehensively addressing women's experience with violence during and after conflict, from sexual violence as a tactic of war to increased domestic violence, trafficking, sexual exploitation and violence in the camps and during displacement. In 2003, the RHRC Consortium publishes a Gender-Based Violence Tools Manual for Assessment and Program Design, Monitoring and Evaluation to assist program planners and implementers in designing research and program initiatives. In 2003, UNHCR publishes an update to its 1995 guidelines entitled Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Against Refugees, Returnees and Internally Displaced Persons – Guidelines for Prevention and Response. The initial focus on sexual violence was expanded to incorporate multiple forms of gender-based violence, and the initial focus on refugee populations was expanded to include returnees and internally displaced. In 2003, a working group on, I quote, women and children in an insecure world, unquote, is established within the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, DCAF, in order to examine the issues of systematic violence within the context of security sector reform and raise awareness among security actors. 2 years later, DCAF publishes Women in an Insecure World, Violence Against Women, Facts, Figures and Analysis, with the goal of showing the scope and multifaceted nature of gender-based violence, as well as the gravity of its consequences for families, communities and societies. In 2005, the joint consortium of Irish human rights, humanitarian and development agencies and development cooperation Ireland decide that Ireland and the international community need to move beyond ad hoc programming to address violence against women and girls at the institutional level. The consortium develops a framework that can be incorporated by all organizations with regard to policy, operations, priorities and resources outlined in Gender-Based Violence, a Failure to Protect, a Challenge to Action. In 2005, Guidelines for Gender-Based Violence Interventions in Humanitarian Settings are issued in 2005 by a task force of the United Nations Interagency Standing Committee IASC. These guidelines provide detailed recommendations for the minimum response required to address sexual violence in emergencies and hold all humanitarian actors responsible for tackling the issue in their respective areas of operation. The guidelines are an important tool in educating all humanitarian actors in their responsibility to combat gender-based violence. In 2005, the cluster approach is adopted as part of humanitarian reform. The Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibility GBVAOR is created as one of 5 functional components of the protection cluster. This marks the first formal effort to establish a globally standardized mechanisms for facilitating a multi-sectoral approach to gender-based violence prevention and response. UNFPA and UNICEF are designated as the global leads for the GBVAOR with an INGO co-lead that rotates each year. The GBVAOR has developed a number of important tools, including in 2010, the Handbook for Coordinating Gender-Based Violence Intervention in Humanitarian Settings. In collaboration with UNFPA, a Managing Gender-Based Violence Programs in Emergencies e-learning course and companion guide, as well as a Caring for Survivors training manual. In 2007, the Gender-Based Violence Coordination course is developed, through the partnership of the United Nations Population Fund UNFPA and the International Center for Reproductive Health ICRH at Ghent University, Belgium, by a small group of technical experts. The curriculum is revised and expanded based on experiences, delivering the course in 2007 to 2009 and feedback from participants during the course and through post-course evaluations. The course is held annually for gender-based violence coordinators in Belgium. In 2007, United Nations Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict UN Action is launched as a network of UN entities working together to end sexual violence occurring during and in the aftermath of armed conflict. UN Action embodies the UN system's response to Security Council resolutions 1820 in June 2008 and 1888 in September 2009, which frame conflict-related sexual violence as a threat to international peace and security. From 2008 to 2013, the UN Security Council adopts 4 resolutions framing conflict-related sexual violence as a threat to international peace and security: 1820 in 2008, 1888 in 2009, 1960 in 2010 and 2106 in 2013. This includes the appointment of a special representatives to the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict. Now let us discuss about vulnerable groups of women. In situation of armed conflict and displacement, some particular groups of girls and women are more vulnerable. Such kind of vulnerability increases in case of targeted ethnic groups where rapes have been used as a weapon of war by the enemy. The lone female heads of household, unaccompanied women and girl children, elderly women, physically and mentally disabled women are frequent targets in this situation. While discussing about the causes of vulnerability of women in armed conflict and in displaced situations, it has been found that many causes are responsible for the increase of women's vulnerability in conflict and displaced situations. These are basically: number 1, lack of legal rights; number 2, impunity; number 3, dependence and lack of economic opportunity; number 4, insufficient ration; number 5, shift in household power dynamics; number 6, socio-cultural norms; number 7, need for firewood and lack of security. Most governments do not have specific laws for refugees or displaced people, which has compelled them to work illegally and pushed them into the informal sector where the possibility of exploitation is much higher. Under such circumstances, gender-based violence is common and perpetrators are not held accountable for their actions. Due to fear and life risk, displaced women are reluctant to report abuse to the authorities. Most displaced communities are dependent on humanitarian aid for food and shelter in refugee camps, but these are not sufficient. Due to limited employment opportunities, displaced women and girls are in search of other means of income opportunities, and under such situations, they may become sex workers, putting themselves high risk of exploitation and abuse. Armed conflicts also change the household pattern where women become the primary heads of the house, and under such situations, male partners feel a loss of status. These emotions that disrupt relationships lead to an increase of domestic violence. The social and cultural norms of many countries facilitate gender-based violence, especially sexual violence. In the name of cultural and tradition, violence may be committed with impunity against women and girls in conflict and displaced situations. The lack of gender sensitivity may expose women to risk and violence. Forced displacement threatens the physical integrity and safety of women. For example, the camps may not be well protected for women with lack of sanitary facilities as well as lack of firewood. Although most of the humanitarian agencies provide food, fuel is not provided by them, and therefore most of the women and girls leave their camp to collect firewood, where they often become victim of rape or sexual assault. Now let us discuss about various kinds of violence against women in the displaced situation. Number 1, rape. Rape is one of the most brutal forms of violence against women. During armed conflict and displacement, women have been raped and tortured as a form of interrogation. In societies where ethnicity is the root of conflict, women are raped, forced to marry to humiliate the man they are related to. Women and girls are kidnapped and used as sexual slaves to service troops. Police and other civilian officials often take advantage of women's insecurity and powerlessness. Number 2 is forced prostitution. Forced prostitution emerged as an instrument to exploit and assault displaced women. Women are forced to become sex workers for food, shelter, as well as safety and security. During post-conflict situation, child prostitution increased with the arrival of peacekeeping personnel in situations where local economics have been devastated. Number 3, trafficking. There is always a close connection between armed conflict and trafficking of women. Women and girls are trafficked to be used in forced prostitution as well as forced labor. The breakdown of law and order, criminal networks involved in dealing with arms and drugs, and open borders have contributed to women's trafficking. For example, in Colombia, the trafficking of young girls and women has risen dramatically during the course of civil war. Number 4 is domestic violence. Domestic violence increases sharply during or after conflict. Men who have witnessed and perpetrated violence during conflict continue to act violently post-conflict. The availability of weapons, lack of income, lack of productive work, stress and humiliation can cause internally displaced men to act violently in their personal lives. After discussion, in the conclusion, we can say that violence against women in conflict is a subject where histories of war have generally remained silent. Earlier, the violence committed against women and children and civilian society used to be treated as a given. But contemporary times have been seen as a change in this attitude, and violence is being acknowledged as an infringement on the human rights of women. nowadays, with the intervention of the United Nations, it has come to be accepted as a violation of women's rights, which continues into the post-conflict situation. This violence has reached epidemic proportions. It is a frequent outcome or protected displacement in refugees and internally displaced persons camps. Civilians have become the primary targets of groups who use terror as a tactic of war. Men and boys as well as women and girls are the victims of this targeting, but women, much more than men, suffer gender-based violence. Throughout the world, women experience violence because they are women and often because they do not have the same rights or autonomy that men do. They are subjected to gender-based persecution, discrimination and oppression, including sexual violence and slavery. Thank you.